Well, if you're just joining us, we've been in the book of Genesis for each, I would say 7 years, but 7 years. That's every fall for 7 years, and we are getting ready. Today is the second to last Genesis sermon, and yeah, I know. And then you'll never have to go back to Genesis ever again. Like you're like, oh, that book is check that one off the off the list. And so if it's been quite a journey. And if you are just joining us, there's 7 years worth of sermons you can go back and listen to at your desire. But really, it's the story of this prelude all the way into the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus opens up with there's a lot of people called the Israelites in the land of Egypt, in slavery. How did they get here? And it's going to tell the story of how they leave Egypt and go into the promised land. So it's how do we get these people called the Israelites? Where did they come from? What's this promise of this promised land? And that's really the book of Genesis. And that's one of the things I love about Genesis. So they go, we're going to start the story from literally the beginning, in the end, in the beginning. You know, there was nothing, but there was God, and He then created everything. And then as we get to the end, as we will see today and next week, as we get to those places, we'll see there's this, a lot of people called the Israelites with this promise, these 12 tribes, and the story that we've been following that are in the land of Egypt. And the story that we've been following is the story of Jacob, who's renamed Israel. Jacob has 12 sons, and those 12 sons will become the 12 tribes of Israel, and then will later on occupy the land. They've all come down because they sold Joseph into slavery. Joseph ends up in Egypt. He prepares Egypt for a great famine. Because of that, he has great favor. And in the middle of this famine, he preserves his family as Jacob and his other 11 sons come down and they're reunited. And one of the promises to Jacob as he's leaving the promised land for this land called Egypt, God promises him, one, you're going to come back to this land, and then two, Joseph, your son, will close your eyes. In other words, that Joseph, your favorite son, he's going to close your eyes. And this morning, we're going to get the death of Jacob, Israel. And we've been following this story for a long time, but today we're going to get a death. And today the sermon is about death and grief. So yay, yay, yay. And it was really odd preparing this sermon as many of you guys know that somebody in our community, Mary Pepper and Michael and Lily's and Anthony's grandmother had passed away, and so, and a wonderful saint, and preparing for that in the midst of preparing for a sermon about the death of Jacob. And one of the things that we talked about on Friday is that death is a weird thing. You know, I find that even Christians and non-Christians, atheists, agnostic, faithful followers of Jesus, that when death happens, there's this universal agreement that something odd has happened. I mean, even talking with an atheist, you know, and they talk about death. Nobody ever goes against death and says, you know what? Death. I mean, you may think to yourself, well, they had it coming, but really, what you think to yourself in death is that something has been violated. Even if you are an atheist, you still, when death happens, no one ever comes to death and says, yeah, that's the process of life. People come, people go. But if we're being honest, is that when death happens, something inside of us goes, something has been violated. And as the Christian, we go, absolutely. Death ought not to reign. In fact, actually, we are created to be eternal. And so this morning, what we're going to get is this story of death and a lot of grief. So if you got your Bibles, open with me to Genesis chapter 49, verse 28, and we're going to go down through chapter 50, verse 14 this morning. All of these are the 12 tribes of Israel. This is what their father said to them as he blessed them, blessing each with the blessing suitable to him. Then he commanded them and said to them, I am to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field in Ephron, the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, that is east of Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephraim the Hittite to possess as a burying place. There they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife, and there they buried Isaac and Rebekah and his wife, and there I buried Leah. The field and the cave that is in it were bought from the Hittites. And when Jacob finished commanding his sons, he drew up his feet into the bed, and he breathed his last, and he was gathered to his people. And so one of the things that Jacob is asked is to take me back and bury me with my family. And that's not an uncommon. It's interesting that death, that's not uncommon. We even think that today. We want to be buried by those in which have gone before us. There's something about that. And with Abraham, remember back in Genesis 12, way back in Genesis 12, there was this promise to Abraham, and God said, I want you to leave the land that you know, for a land that I'm going to show you, I'm going to give to you. And I'm going to give you this land and all these descendants, except for he had no kids and no land. And God's like, yeah, I'm going to give you all of this land and all these descendants. He goes, I got no land and no kids. The first legitimate claim he has on the land is he buys a burial plot, basically. And so what Jacob says is, I want to go back to that. And then Jacob dies. As we're going to see this morning, is that Joseph mourns. And I think there's a danger a lot of times when we read the Bible, and we read the Bible with a lack of empathy. So Joseph loses his father, and he mourns. And we think to ourselves, yeah, but what does that have to do with me? Like, what am I supposed to get out of this story? Jacob dies, Joseph loses his father, and he mourns. Great. However, how does that apply to my life? Now, here's an interesting thing, right? Is that it's really sometimes hard to mourn the death of somebody else's parent, but you know what it would be like to mourn the death of your parent. I know that some of you in this room, you've lost a father and mother. Some of you haven't. If you think about losing your father and mother, the grief, even the thought of that overwhelms you. Or if you went to the funeral of somebody else who lost their father or their mother, and you think about losing your own, and then that grief is not equivalent. Like you cannot grieve at that same level, but there is something about the empathy that says, man, they lost their father and mother. You know what that's like, and this is now what Joseph is going through. After a reunification, he's lost his dad, and we're going to see here this picture into what it looks like to mourn. And so Jacob says, return me. He gave all of the blessings, and he drew up his feet into the bed and breathed his last. Verse 1 of chapter 50. Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. That's Jacob. 40 days were required for it. For that is how many are required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. Let me read that again. Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So physicians embalmed Israel. 40 days were required for it. That is how many days are required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. And so we see this picture of grief. Now, grief is a weird thing, is it not? And part of it is because what do we go, part of being an American, right, is what? Life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. And so it's hard to live in a world where we have a culture that values happiness, and yet there's this thing called grief that keeps on rearing its ugly head. And how do we do that? And actually, a lot of times, what it feels like is that grief is working against us, because if our goal is happiness, and then grief comes in as an affront to that goal. And so then what do we do with it? And the hard part with this is that grief is unavoidable. I mean, know this, is that you can avoid it all that you want. And I know people, they try to avoid grief at all costs. And I go, here's a weird thing about grief. One, it's avoidable. And two, even if you try to avoid it, you'll be unsuccessful, and it will find a way out. And either you find some ways to let it out, or it's like Play-Doh. The more you shove it in, it's going to start coming out the sides, and it's going to come out in ways in which you don't want or anticipate. It's unavoidable, and it's going to find a way out. Because here is the thing. Every time you have loss, you have grief. Every time you lose something, you have grief. Now, this is probably most obvious when you lose someone that you love, right? Because there's this loss, there's this death. There's a death there's a finality to death, but there's this loss of relationship, this loss of life, this loss of influence, this loss of conversations and experiences and events and memories. There's a lot of loss there, but it's not just that kind of loss. We think mostly about grief and death, but grief happens every time you lose something. If you lose a relationship through you break up, you lose a relationship through divorce, there's going to be grief. Every time you lose, think about this, every time you lose a physical capability, there is grief. In fact, actually what happens a lot of times when somebody's walking with somebody through death is that they, especially if it's an elongated process of death, in other words, it's a long disease that takes the person, is that actually when death happens, it almost feels like a release, and then it's quickly followed by guilt, because like, oh no, but I should be sad. Why am I joyful? Because I should be sad. And what I always say is because you've been grieving the whole way. You grieved the diagnosis. You grieved when they couldn't walk anymore. You grieved when they couldn't change themselves. You grieved when they forgot who you were. Like you've been grieving this whole time, and you'll still grieve, but you've been grieving the losses as they go. Opposed to somebody who maybe dies in a car accident, and then all of a sudden all of that grief comes in at once. So every time you lose something, there's grief. This would happen if you lose a job, right? There's grief. Even if you're like, that was a dumb job anyways, there's still grief in the loss of a job. There's a loss if you lose mental capacities. There's grief. And some of you know this grief as you're walking through this kind of grief. So that loss equals grief, but here I'm going to complicate it even more for you. Every time something changes in your life, you lose something. So change equals loss. Loss equals grief. And as you know, life is constantly changing. So the reason why I say this is because it's unavoidable. Grief is unavoidable. And if we live in a life, and we go one of our main values is the pursuit of happiness, is that grief will always seem like something's wrong, and there's an affront to this goal of happiness. And so then we think about this thing, so when you lose good things, you grieve. And I go, no. Well, yes, but no. Every time there's a change, there's a loss. Every time you lose something, there's grief. And that could be a good thing, right? But it could also be like something that you would think, that's a bad thing. I mean, to give you an example of this, one of the things I will tell college students as they get ready to graduate and get out into the real world is that I said, just so you know, you're going to grieve this. And it's like, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? Like, I know it's going to sound crazy, but the fall is going to hit. You're not going to go back to school, and there's going to be a sadness in you. And somebody may even say to you, like, so you want to be back in school? And you go, no, I'm glad that I'm done. Like, I don't want to go back. I don't miss the test. But there's a sadness in you. And I go, what's that sadness? I go, that sadness is because something has changed. Because of the change, there's a loss. Because of the loss, there's a grief. Even if you would go, I don't want to go back there, but there still is that. In fact, actually just this week, as I was once again preparing for this message, one of the guys from our cohort sent me a picture, and another guy in our cohort from our doctoral program sent the two of us a picture of a place that we used to go after class. And it was just because he was up there, Portland. He's like, look where I'm at. And truth be told, there was a sadness about me. I was like, yeah. And I even texted like, oh man, that was good. That was good. And so you want to you wish you were back in that program? Like, no, I'm glad that it's done. I'm glad that it's done. I'm glad that the box is checked. But there is a sadness. Why? Because change equals loss. Loss equals grief. And so what we see here is that grief is unavoidable. And then what you see here is, what does it say? There are these 70 days. 70 days of mourning. Doesn't that sound so weird in our culture? There were 70 days of mourning. And I mean, just think about this. If you ask somebody, like you said, hey, how are you doing? They go, because they lost somebody, and you go, how are you doing? They go, good. I'm okay. I'm in 45 out of 70 days of mourning right now. They go, that's really weird. Like, that's odd. Like, what are you talking about, man? And I thought, even if that's the truth, I go, well, that's really weird. That's really weird that somebody would say that to you. I go, but is it possible that we're the weird ones? That we're the odd ones? Like, in other words, to say is we think that grief is a moment, and they're like, no, bro. Like, grief is a season. There's what we call a season of grief. And we don't think like that. We don't think about a season of grief. In fact, actually, a lot of times what we think, and largely I think we think this because we want this, we think that grief is a moment. And I go, well, it could be a moment that lasts a season. And so, but it's really a season. And here's often what happens is the loss happens in a moment. But the grief is a season. And so often if you think about this, the loss, not all the time, but a lot of times, the loss happens in a moment, and that moment then kicks off a season of grief. And here's the hard part about grief, is that you all of a sudden don't know where in the season you are, right? And it's hard you may be able to pinpoint the beginning of the season, but often I found that it's hard to pinpoint the end of the season. I mean, just think about our seasons, right? We're in the fall now. It's very clear. When did the fall start? You go, oh, yeah, there's a calendar date. Yeah, there's a calendar date. You go, but we all know that calendar date is garbage because it does not mean that fall, it's like 100 degrees. Like, well, it's fall now. It's like, it's 110 degrees out. And you go, so then you go, so then when feeling-wise, when did fall start? What day was that? And truth be told, this happens to you every single season. I don't know. I know we're not in summer anymore. I know we're in fall, but I can't actually tell you at what moment it stopped being summer and started being fall. But I can tell you this: we're in fall now. And so there is this season of grief, not just a moment of grief, but a season of grief. And so we see this. And maybe you're in a season of grief right now. Once again, change equals loss, loss equals grief. And maybe you're in a season of grief right now. And here's the thing that I found about grief. It's a weird thing. I have mourned things that I've lost that I'm like, I shouldn't be mourning that. Why am I mourning that? That's dumb. And by the way, telling grief it's dumb does not help at all either. Like, well, you're just being stupid. No, it's like this idea that there's loss, and then there's a sadness. Now I say this, and I want to say that it's a good thing. It's a good thing that when there's change, that we lose things. When we lose things, that we have grief. Because you know that there are people in this world who lose things, very meaningful things. They lose very meaningful things, and they don't feel any sort of sadness. And you think to yourself, it must be nice. I go, no, we call them sociopaths. Okay, those are sociopaths. They lose things, they lose relationships, and they go, yeah, I'm not affected at all. And I'm like, yeah, so don't be a sociopath. But point one, don't be a sociopath. In a sense, when we lose things, We should grieve. And so what we see here, we see this. And not only did Joseph grieve, what does it say here? That all of Egypt grieved for 70 days. And I go, there's something else. We don't understand. We think that that grief is a moment, and they're like, no, it's a season. And then we think that grief happens isolated, in isolation. And he goes, no, that grief happens in community, that the community grieved. Now, here's the weird thing. If you're grieving, or if you've felt like you're grieving, or if you've grieved in the past, which you have, you ever felt like you need to hide it? Like you have to I've got to you got to like the goal of life is to be suffering great grief, and everybody around me says, I couldn't even tell. And what's crazy is we think then we're crushing it. Like there's this great sadness about us, and everyone around us like, oh, there was that major loss. I couldn't even tell. You're like, yep, crushing life. I go, maybe we're not actually. If those that are closest to us can't tell us that we're grieving, then that's not a win. Now, there are two people maybe sometimes in this world, the two extremes, one where they would never share their grief with anybody. That's a problem. And then there are other people that will share their grief with everybody, right? And even the clerk at the checkout say, how are you doing? It's like, well, my dad died today. So like, oh no, I'm so sorry. And so really what I say is you want to grieve in trusted community. And here's the thing about grieving in community. When you're grieving in community, if you've been there or you are there, there's these times where you feel like a bit of a leper, don't you? Like an outcast. And sometimes you feel like an outcast because people are afraid that if your grief comes close to them, like it's contagious. Like it's just and then it affronts your pursuit of happiness, and then it's going to affront my pursuit of happiness. And so sometimes, especially in community, grief can feel like you're a leper because people are afraid that you might be contagious, that your grief might become part of my grief. Now, here's the hard biblical truth, is that the Bible says 100% their grief ought to be contagious. The thing you so fear that maybe your grief would oh no, become part of my grief. No, the Bible says yes. That's empathy. We don't grieve at the same level, but we grieve at the level, if you grieve, I grieve. Right? I mean, we see this throughout the Bible, that we weep with those who weep. That Jesus says that the blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And so then we let the shame of our grief move us to isolation. And the Bible says no, that we actually ought to grieve in community. And then we're to respond to that grief with empathy. I mean, especially for those of you who are married, you want some really good conversations, especially if there's been change in your life. You ask, what's been the change? This has been the change. Of that change, what do you feel like we've lost? I mean, this could be even like going from like a kid graduating from high school, right? This would be like I just feel like there's that loss of some dependence. And so do you want them to be dependent on you the rest of their life? No, but in a weird way, I grieve changing diapers, right? Or something like that. It could just be something like that. And you ask your spouse, what's changed? What's been the loss of that change? And where do you feel like right now you're grieving the change? As today is January, it's our 1-year anniversary. Woohoo! We done made it. We done made it. But actually, as we were engaged in getting to get married, we talked about grieving our singleness. And you go, so you don't want to get married? Like, that sounds like a weird conversation to have with your to-be spouse, right? Yeah, let's talk about what grieving about not being single anymore. But there was this important conversation to say, let's just name it. Let's talk it through. There's a change coming, wonderful, great change coming. But let's talk about some things that are going to change that we're going to grieve, and that's okay. And so, anyways, all that to be said is that these lead to these conversations. So when there's change, there's loss. When there's loss, there's grief. Grief is a season, and it's to be experienced in community, not in isolation. It goes on in verse 4. And when the days of the weeping for him were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, if now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, my father made me swear, saying, I am about to die in my tomb that I have hewed out for myself in the land of Canaan. There you shall bury me. Now therefore let me please go up and bury my father, and then I will return. And Pharaoh answered, go up and bury your father as he made you swear. So Joseph went up to bury his father. With him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as the household of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's household. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen. It was a very great company. And when they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they lamented there with a very great and grievous lamentation. And he made a mourning for his father 7 days. When the inhabitants of the lands of Canaan, of the Canaanites, saw the mourning on the threshing floor of Atad, they said, this is a grievous mourning by the Egyptians. Therefore, the place was named Abel Mizraim, is beyond the Jordan. Thus his sons did for him as he had commanded them, for his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave in the field of Machpelah, of the east of Mamre, which Abraham bought the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers who had gone up with him to bury his father. And so what we see is that Jacob is past. Joseph says, I've made this promise to go and bury my father. He says, let me have this conversation with Pharaoh. Pharaoh, can I go up? I promise that I'm going to come back. In other words, I'm not going to stay up there. I'm not doing this to leave you. I'm going to go bury my father, and I'm going to come back. And then we see that process is they go up, they grieve even more. And what we see here is that what Joseph does is he keeps his commitments, and then he makes these new commitments. You know, it's one of those things, if you want to know if you're actually truly a person of your word, if you can keep your word to a dead person, that's a good sign. That's a really, really good sign. Now, everybody says that, right? There may be a memorial service or something that we've experienced where people will make great promises, or even on a deathbed, great promises. But we all know that there's been many of promises made to somebody who's dying that have never been fulfilled. There's many words of promise that have been said at memorial services that's never been fulfilled. But you know this, if you can keep your promise to a dead person, you tend to be a person of your word. Why? Because there's no accountability, right? There's no follow-up. There's no thank you. There's no deepening of the relationship. All you are at that point is being driven by your commitment and being a person of integrity that's true to your word. And so what we see here is that what Joseph does, Joseph said, I made this promise, and so now I have to fulfill this promise. And one of the things I love here is that in this season of grief, I think one of the things you should do is do your best to keep your commitments. In a season of grief, do your best to keep your commitments. Now, there's wisdom in this, right? So it's like, it's like your father's memorial service. And you're like, but I did already have lunch plans, so I'm going to go to the lunch instead. Like, no. Reschedule the lunch, go to the memorial service, but do your best to keep your commitments. And I say this because what I have found is whether people know that they're in a season of grief or not, is they actually use that season as a justification to breaking their commitments. And I go, no. You're in a season of grief? Yes. Keep your commitments. And not only keep your commitments, but don't be afraid of making new commitments. I mean, this is what he says to Pharaoh, right? Pharaoh, not only have I made a commitment to my Father, but I'm going to make a commitment to you too. I'm going to return. And actually, that's what it tells us down in verse 14, is that he actually does return. Once again, there's wisdom here to making new commitments. What I don't want you to hear me say is like, my father passed, so I should go buy a car. Like, no, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that don't be afraid to make new plans. I do find that oftentimes in grief, what happens is people, they get stuck in a moment. And they're afraid to make new plans. They don't keep their word, and they're afraid of making new words. And I go, no. In the season of grief, keep your commitments and don't be afraid of making new commitments. And here's why. Because grief can be disorienting. I don't know if you've ever been there. Grief can turn your world upside down. You don't know which way is up. You don't know which way is down. You don't know what's left. You don't know what's right. And I'll tell you, in those moments, the commitments you've made and the commitments you make will help get your bearing straight and reorient your life. I can tell you this as an example from my own personal example, is that in a season of grief, and by the way, these are keeping your commitments to your God, to your work, to your spouse, to your family. But in a season of grief, like I would make these commitments. I would say yes to something. And that thing would get closer, and I would, you know what I think to myself? Why did I say yes to this thing? I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it. And it get closer, and the closer it got, I'd be like, I don't want to do it. And then it would get closer, and then I would go do that thing, and sometimes I'm getting in the car, I'm like, well, I said I would do it, and so here I go, and this is the last time I say that I'm going to do this thing. That's it, because why did I do this? And I get in the car, and I go do that thing, because, trying to be a person of my word, and it would be great and wonderful, and I would drive home thinking to myself, I'm really glad I did that thing. And then it'd come up again, and I'd go, why did I say yes to this thing? I don't want to do it, but I'm going to go because I said that I would, and I would go, and in the car ride home, I'd think to myself, I'm really glad I did that thing. You see that grief can be disorienting. Grief can flip your world upside down. It can question everything. But I want to encourage you to keep your commitments and don't be afraid of making new commitments in this season of grief. The other thing what I want you to know here, as you saw in verse 4, isn't this interesting? So in verse 4, it says, and when the days of weeping for him were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh. So the days of weeping have passed. The 70 days have passed. But as you notice, like later on in the verse, there's a whole lot of lamenting going on. There's a whole lot of grieving. Even it's like this is a great grieving, a great lamentation. And you think to yourself, but I thought they said in verse 4 that the days of grieving were over. And I love this because there's a wisdom here. This idea that there was time set up for grieving, that time has passed, but there's also a realization that grieving isn't so keen to be in like just 70 days. I love what here's, there's a 70 days for everyone to grieve, but they realize, especially Joseph, that the grieving isn't contained within those 70 days, that there's still grieving that goes beyond that. And so the two things that I want you to know about the season of grief is one, don't rush it. This is all that you ever think about in grief. You think to yourself, I just want it to be over. I want it to be over. How much longer is this season? How much longer will this season last? And you want to rush it. You want it to be done so fast, so quick, because you don't want to be there. Don't rush grief. I've seen people make terrible decisions because they just wanted to rush grief. And here's the thing about grief, the season of it. You'll think that it's over. You're like, oh yeah, I think it's over. I think the season's over. And then something happens, you're like, nope, not over at all. And then a new wave. And you go, what's that all about? And then you feel like, I'm just back where I was before. And I go, no, you're not. You think about the seasons once again, about just the seasons that we live in. Once again, remember I said, where does fall end? Where does summer end and fall begin? You go, I don't know. It's somewhere in there. But you know this, right? We have what's called false fall, right? You know false fall, right? It like kicks in and you're like, oh yeah, fall is here. But if you lived in California long enough, you're like, don't even get used to it. Put the pumpkin spice lattes back because it's not actually here. And sure enough, there's this fall. There's like these days where it feels like fall, followed by like these 105 degree days. You're like, no. But if you've been in California long enough and you've gone through the seasons long enough, you know it's just that. But you also know that it's not the middle of summer anymore. Even when false fall kicks in, you go, this is giving us a taste of what's to come. But you don't think to yourself in that false fall in the middle of September, great. It's like, we're in June again. You go, well, it may feel like June today, but it won't feel like June in a month. And so there's this season of grief. Don't rush it. The other thing I want to warn you about is don't tarry it either. And I think this sometimes can be the harder place, is that people want to rush it or they never want to leave it. And what I would say is don't rush it and don't tarry it. There does need to come a time where you go, my season for grieving this has ended. And that doesn't mean that you'll never grieve it again, or that it'll never pop up or rear its ugly head again. But what I'm saying is that there comes a time where you go, I think the grief has been enough. And we even see this with Joseph. Joseph doesn't stay in Israel. Even verse 14. After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had gone with him to bury his father. So they return. And here's the thing. Because we think like, well, if I leave it, that means so many things. Because I think that we think about it in the wrong sense. Because I know that grief is, the season of grief is done when I have, quote unquote, gotten over it. Right? If you're like, when do you think you'll get over that? That's a terrible question to ask somebody grieving, by the way. Like, so when do you think you're going to get over this thing? Because how does one, as I would say, how does one get over the death of their father? How does one get over the death of their spouse? How does one, quote unquote, get over the death of their child? And I think that's what we think. The season is done when I'm, quote unquote, over it. And if I'm not, quote unquote, over it, it's still a season of grief. I go, here's the thing. It will always be with you. But there does need to be an end to the season of grief. And not that you're not over it, or people may even say like, I'm just, I'll know that I know that the season of grief is over when everything's back to normal. Let's just look at Joseph and Jacob's story here. What would back to normal look like for Joseph? Back to normal would be his father is alive, right? There's no getting back to normal. Because his father is passed and is not going to be resurrected. There's other stories where people are resurrected, but it's not this story, right? There's not this one. Is that there's not getting back to normal? Like normal would be his father's alive. He's not going to get back to that. What he's going to do, though, is that he's going to move forward. You go forward knowing these things are still true, that you carry with it. And so you don't rush grief, but you don't tarry it either. And there is a time for the season to end. And that end doesn't mean forgetting, right? You still carry it with you. But it no longer is a driving force in your life. And we see this, right? Ecclesiastes tells us this. There's a time to weep, and there's a time to laugh. There's a time to mourn, and there's a time to dance. There are seasons of all of these things. And so grief is unavoidable. It's going to find you. And it's going to find you. And if it hasn't already found you, because change is loss is grief, right? And so my prayer for you really is that you don't rush it, and you don't tarry it either. And what we see here is that And what I want you to know is that the grief is really temporal. You know? It may be your whole life, grieving things at different levels, but grief is temporal. It's actually one of the things that we believe is true within Christianity, that we won't always grieve. Even as we were grieving on Friday, and still so with Mary, is that this is temporal. We believe that there is a day, there's a time, there's an age coming where there are no more tears. There is no more loss. Change, I don't know, I guess. Some of you guys are like, good, I hope there's no change in heaven. I hate change. No change in heaven. In fact, my perfect world is no change. That I don't know. What I know is that there's no loss. There's no mourning. There's no tears in that sense. There's no death and disease. As we would say, everything is as it ought to be. This grief that we feel today, at some level, is temporal, which means that there will be an end to it. And so what do we do? Right? Until then, I think we know some things. Until that day, know this, that we have a God who meets us in our grief. It's one of the prophecies about Jesus the Messiah was that he would be a man of sorrows, one acquainted with grief. We just never think about Jesus like that, do we? I mean, we think about Jesus like happy-go-lucky, right? Happy-go-lucky. What do you got? A demon? Oh, demon gone. What else do you want? We got food for you guys, and we got drinks for you guys, and leprosy gone, and you get a car, and you get a car, and you get a car, and we think about a happy-go-lucky Jesus, but actually one of the prophecies that says that you'll know him because there'll be this sadness about him. He carries this. He's a man of sorrows, one acquainted with grief. Does it mean that he didn't have joy? No, of course he had joy. We even see times that he wept. He wept over Lazarus, right? He looks at Jerusalem because he's the one who knows truly what's been lost. Here's the thing. Not only does Jesus meet you in your grief, his grief is greater than your grief. Because you're grieving what's been lost. And Jesus is grieving what he really knows has been lost. And not just for you, but for the world through sin and rebellion and death. And so you have a Jesus who will meet you in your grief, who then understands your grief. And here's the beautiful thing. So not only does he meet you in it, he understands you in it, he will not leave you there. He will not. One of the beautiful things about the Bible and the gospel is that we have these promises that God will take our grief and then give us joy. Right? Beauty for ashes. Right? So the ashes are the mourning. Like there's the sadness. We heap ashes, and he's going to give you beauty for ashes. The oil of joy, so as a kid, I thought it was the oil of joy in the morning. No, it's the oil of joy. It's the oil of joy in the morning. Like you wake up in the morning, where's the oil of joy? It's the oil of joy for mourning, the sadness, the oil of joy for sadness. And you go, how does he do that? I go, sometimes I don't know. It's supernatural, but these are the promises that he will take your grief and give you joy. And a lot of times what I find is that it's actually the grief and the joy, it's the same source. Because a lot of times we think, oh, okay, that is like, it's like we think that the grief happens over here, and then the joy will happen in this unrelated place over here, right? So like, hey, I'm sorry your dad died, but here's a puppy, right? So that's the idea. It's like that joy will overwhelm this grief, but a lot of times it's the same source. And I think ultimately we see this in the cross, do we not? Is the cross the source of grief or joy? If you're a follower of Jesus, you know the answer to that question is a trick question by the pastor. It's yes. The cross is the source of both grief and joy. the grief of rejection of Jesus and his death, of sin and rebellion, the joy of salvation, forgiveness. And I think that not only is he doing that on the grand scale, he wants to do that with you. It's okay that you grieve, right? Don't be a sociopath. It's okay that you grieve. And it's okay that you're in a season of grief. But know that this grief is just a season. Don't stay there. Don't rush from it. And know that the God that you trust in Jesus, he's looking to change your grief for joy. If you're not a Christian, my prayer for you is that you would become a Christian. That without Jesus, I think that all we would have is grief. Just loss. But because of Jesus and what he's done for you and for us, we have the opportunity to have a grief that is then turned into joy. My prayer for you that ultimately in salvation you would experience the greatest joy. And for you as a Christian, know that not only you in a season of grief, but there's others around you in seasons of grief. And as the church, we are called to rejoice with those who rejoice and to weep with those who weep. We celebrate with those who are celebrating, and we mourn with those who are mourning, knowing that we cannot mourn with them at the same level, but we can mourn with them. Let's pray. God, we thank you for your goodness. We thank you that you are not put off by our grief. You're not ashamed of it. But God, actually in our grief, Jesus, you stepped down into it. You even were willing to be identified by it and then to redeem and save us from it. God, I just know in this room that we are probably all in some sort of season of grief in varying degrees because there has been loss, there has been change. And I know that in our world that just is, the pursuit of happiness is an idol at times. That grief confronts that, and yet it's unavoidable. And so I pray that you would walk with us through it. I pray that we'd be able to talk this with other people in our lives so that we don't grieve in isolation, but we grieve in community, that we actually allow others to grieve with us. And ultimately we pray that you would turn our source of grief into a source of joy. And we don't need to know how you will do that to have confidence that you will. And we thank you that there is a time coming and for eternity where tears of loss and grief, of sorrow will be no more. And for that day, we long for that day. And until that day, may we grieve well. We love you. We pray for these things in your name. Amen. Amen. God bless you guys, and we'll see you next week for the end of Genesis, the very last sermon in the book of Genesis. So